I never thought in a series on the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan that we would spend so much time talking about Aristotle. But that's where Lacan is here at the start of Seminar 19. And at the start of our series on Seminar 19, I told you why. There are two reasons primarily why Lacan goes running back to Aristotle. First, he wants to recover an approach to writing that is logical but unbeholden to signifiers and even standard alphabetic figures, read letters. This is why, or at least why it shouldn't be surprising to you, that he and his S's are always twisted, contorted, marked upside down, and barred. This is how he thinks, and it's the type of writing that he's also pioneering here. He thinks, however, that he's drawing it directly forward from the Aristotelian tradition of logic, where we're not dealing with signifiers and we're not dealing with letters, but instead with written symbols that hold places for specific functions. So the S's are barred and numbered. The capital A's are upside down. And now we've got capital E's backwards, overlined, and the like. He is after a certain written symbol system that is carrying forward from Aristotle. That's reason one. He goes running back to old boy Aristotle. But there's another one that is now top of mind to you, one that you might, just like to forget entirely, and that is the issue of the modalities. Aristotelian modalities, modal logic, is also what Lacan has on the brain, and also why he goes dipping back into Aristotle's thought. Even if this also allows Lacan to make what I believe to be kind of a wrong turn at this point. But again, remember, he's just getting started with this stuff. Lacan has been thinking about modalities, though, for quite some time. If you really want to push this button, all the way back to when he wasn't dealing with Aristotle primarily, but instead with Heidegger. Heidegger, at that point in the 50s, was the great original that Lacan was trying to overcome. Now, I say great original and overcome for those of you that also read Harold Bloom and Anxiety of Influence, because again, that's part of what I think is happening here with Lacan. He's so damn determined to one-up Aristotle that he misses some of the own implications of his thought. In this case, around the modalities, though, it's with Heidegger and being towards death, one's own most potentiality, that necessary horizon, that Lacan first gets started thinking modally. And the logic there is one of potentiality, which we have yet to discuss and which we are going to discuss in this lecture. It is also an occupant of modal logic. Now, what we have so far in terms of modalities, the necessary, the impossible, the possible, and the contingent, all four of these modalities map onto all four of Lacan's formulas of sexuation. We've suggested, again, just following his lead, not saying we line them up exactly as he does. You can see the last lecture for that. But that they are in play, and he is working hard to try and clarify his formulas of sexuation using modal logic derived from Aristotle. That's the second reason he goes running back to old boy Aristotle. Now, you just heard me say these four basic Aristotelian modalities: necessity, impossibility, possibility, and contingency. And in our last lecture, I told you that each has a certain bearing on truth. You can have necessary truths that can't be otherwise, impossible truths that simply can't be, possible truths that may be, and contingent truths that are but didn't have to be. So the modalities are there for our purposes in terms of their ability to clarify the truth value of specific propositions, statements, formulas. These truth values are variable. These bearings on truth that the modals allow Lacan to get into and that he invokes at the start of Seminar 19, and which he begins to assign to his formulas of sexuation, and always, it seems, in an apparent effort to one-up Aristotle, are key. When I say that each has a certain bearing on truth, I mean to put this key into your hand. What I mean is that each Modality, when attached to the formula, allows that formula's truth value to come into focus. So if a statement is necessarily true, regardless of Lacan's formulas, we can just talk broadly here about this as a form of review and a kind of summative statement on these four before I introduce you to a fifth. I'm sorry. Can't stop, won't stop. Is that necessity? I think it might be. If a statement is necessarily true, can't stop, won't stop, it can't possibly be false. If all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, then the statement Socrates is somehow going to find his way back to the earth because, Socrates is going to die, that must be true. It's necessary. The truth is necessary. It can't be avoided. It's at the level of that syllogism. All men are mortal. This fella Socrates is a man. Therefore, the therefore necessarily follows from the two premises in this syllogism. It is a watertight argument, but it is only existing at the level of the argument, at the level of the syllogism, at the level of discourse. And that's just it. If a truth is necessary, unavoidable, irreducible, etc., like the fact that Socrates will die following on those two premises, it is utterly, wholly, and often absurdly discursive. Necessity, hear me now, at the level of truth is logical, structural, discursive, and wholly indicative and endemic to beings who speak, namely us. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about the impossible again. This is a tricky one. It really is a tricky one. If the modality of a statement or a proposition is impossible, that means that it cannot possibly be true. An impossible proposition is a necessarily false proposition. Now, check it out. If something is necessary, it must be. If something is impossible, it cannot be. So see, I want you to be really crystallized around these lines of thought because this is where Lacan is putting each of his formulas of sexuation. And once you get crystalline around the modalities, you can see how the four formulas start to fit together into, you know what I'm going. I'm going with the math theme. They fit together into the formation of a math theme. We'll come to that. Right now, let's just stick with this second modality, the impossible. If something's necessary, it has to be. If something is impossible, it can't be. So, the father of the primal horde, yeah, he's back again. He is a mythical, phantasmatic figure because he cannot possibly exist. His existence cannot possibly be true. In other words, this myth from totem and taboo is necessarily false. Why? Because if it were true, Lacan's first formula for masculine enjoyment, all men are determined by the phallic function, all men are castrated, and so forth, it would be false. Because there'd be one man who's not castrated. In other words, if the father of the primal horde as a man did exist, and his existence was not pinned to castration, there would be a man out there in the world, I don't fucking know, then, now, in the future, there would be the figure of a man who is not castrated, who is not determined by the phallic function, and this would give the lie to all men are determined by the phallic function, because there'd be one who's not. And this collapse of the first formula that would result from the existence of this real man, it would also obviate the logical, structural need for the second formula, the one that frames this real man, and with it, the myth of the father itself. So let's see what the main claim here is, what the takeaway point here is. You can tell I'm trying to get somewhere. If all men are necessarily castrated, it's impossible to find one who's not. That's the important part. I'm not saying he's out there. I'm saying he's not out there, and that's why you cannot find him. Why finding him is impossible. Because all men are castrated. There is not one out there. There is not one out there. Emphasis on the is. Moving on to the possible. If the truth of a statement is possible, what does that mean? It means that this statement is not necessarily false. It means, in other words, that it could be true. It means that it's possible. Regardless of whether, let me take this for, what's your name? No, don't say it. Don't say it. No, don't say it. I wouldn't want it to be revealed on this. No. Regardless of whether your name is Iris, it's certainly possible. It is certainly possible, regardless of whether anyone tuning into this lecture right now is actually named Iris, it could be true. The truth of the statement, someone tuning into this call is named Iris, is certainly possible. It could be true, which means that the truth value of that statement is possible, if you will. Hence Lacan's first formula for feminine subjectivity. Not all women have dealings with the phallic function. Not all women are castrated. Now, if not all women are castrated, it means, among several other things, that the truth of any given woman's relation to castration is possible. Even Lacan, as we noted in our last lecture, says as much. Every feminized subject you meet might be castrated, which means, check it out, that her castration is not guaranteed. Unless you're a man, and I think this is a really important part in all of this, if you're a man, you only have access to woman at the level of her castration. You can only see castrated women, and thus you are predisposed to see only castrated women, because those are the only types of women that show up. That's the only side of woman that appears. Not all woman is exactly how men encounter woman, as not all. They only ever encounter this part of woman insofar as it is castrated. Now you could figure this a little more broadly. Think back, for instance, to some Poco theory arguments around whether the colonizer can hear the subaltern. Can the colonizer hear the subaltern speak? No, they can't. The subaltern are speaking left and right, because you remember the question. The question was initially, can the subaltern speak? And Gayatri Spivak and folks after her came along and said, that's fucking ridiculous. Of course they can speak. The question is whether the master can hear. And the answer to that question is they can't. They only have ears to hear people who speak like the master. The colonized are speaking left and right. It's the colonizer who doesn't have ears to hear. The same is true of masculine and feminine subjectivities. Women are enjoying in lots of different ways, but men can only see certain fields of enjoyment that women have access to, namely those determined by the phallic function. Masculine subjects, let me be clear, cannot see uncastrated women, nor even the aspects of castrated women's lives that are not castrated, because they are capable of seeing only signs of castration. This is one of the limits of the masculine structure. It can only see signs of castration. Man can only recognize women who are not all, not whole, split, divided, fragmented, partial, in short, only recognize the parts of them that show up as castrated. It's really a phenomenological question here, relative to the masculine structure. The man just doesn't have eyes to see, ears to hear, and so on and so forth. They can only see the parts of feminine subjectivity that are determined by, beholden to, engaged in the phallic function. Now, if this logic holds, it's fair to say that no masculine subject tuning into this lecture has ever met a woman who's not castrated to some extent. You see how we just arrived at the other formula for feminine enjoyment? Here is that second formula, that one that gives us a sense of contingency, of a contingent truth. There may be some women out there right now, dear fellows, who are enjoying beyond the castrative function, beyond the field of phallic enjoyment. You ain't going to have access to that. because as a masculinized subject, you only have eyes and ears that allow for the phenomenological appearance of castrated subjects and enjoyments thereof. Because the castration of feminine subjects is not a given, but also can't be ruled out, the truth of any one woman's castration is contingent. That's the bottom line when it comes to this stuff. And this is one of the ways that men are also blind. I don't know that masculine structures allow for the realization that the truth of feminine castration is not just possible, but when it shows up as such within the masculine phenomenal field, that the truth of that showing up is a contingent truth. Look as hard and as far as you want. You'll not find any woman who is not a little bit castrated, dear men. Now, what that means is it preserves the possibility that you could find one who's not, that there could be one who's enjoying in a different way. Because the castration of feminine subjects, let me hit this again, is not a given, the next one you meet might be different, although we know how impossible that is relative to the necessary phallic dependence of man. But it's not a given, this castration of the feminine subject. And it also can't be ruled out. So when you do meet a woman, and she does seem to be determined by the phallic function, the truth of that determination is totally contingent because it could have been otherwise. It could still be otherwise. Let me be clear. The next woman you meet, and by woman I mean feminized subject. I'm a woman in Lacan's sense. You might be a man, dear lady, in Lacan's sense. These are subject positions. These are operations. These are positions in the symbolic order. The next so-called woman you meet, think feminized subject. She, even if she's a he, will almost certainly be castrated to some extent, but this isn't guaranteed. And it's that this isn't guaranteed part that opens the conversation for us. Let me see if I can sum this up then. The castration of any given man is essential, you've heard me say. But don't forget the flip side of this. The castration of any given woman is not essential, it's accidental, because it never has to be. Why am I doing all this? Why am I once again dragging you through the very thing that I'm sure caused you to feel just as sick as I was when I told you about this shit last time around? Why are we rehearsing these 4 basic modalities? It's not just to keep us moving toward a matheme of sexuation, as you've been hearing me discuss it, but also to better recall where all this modal talk started in Seminar 19. I mentioned this in our last get-together, or in the last recording. It's kind of a get-together in the virtual sense. As I mentioned in our last recording, Lacan's first foray into modal logic in Seminar 19 comes on page 13. And again, with a nod to you-know-who, old boy Aristotle. If only, I think again, to more convincingly subvert him. I called that passage out last time. We are now poised to read it. It's on page 13. It's really starts about the middle of the page with the paragraph that begins, of course, with Aristotle. Aristotle plays 4 categories against one another. These are the 4 categories we're working at. There is the possible, which he pits against the impossible. Makes sense. And the necessary, which he pits against the contingent. We shall see that nothing in these oppositions holds water, Lacan says. For today, I'm simply pointing out to you that what is involved in the formulation of the necessary, which is strictly speaking not to be able not to, this is what specifically defines necessity for us. If something is necessary, you are not able not to avoid it. Does that make sense? Where does that lead, Lacan then asks, from the impossible not to be able That's how he understands the impossible here at the start of Seminar 19. Not to be able. Where this leads, though, is from this impossibility, which means not to be able, to an able not to, Lacan says. This is a really crucial turn of phrase that he has yet to make good on, but it is right here on page 13. We're going to try and make good on this phrase. What does it mean to be able not to do something, be something, become someone? Lacan asks about this able not to. What does it mean to be able not to do something? He says, is this possible or contingent? It's like he's so determined to figure out where everything fits according to this like tetradic structure of the four modalities that he can't see, hear me now, that he's actually got a fifth modality on his hands. Able not to marks another modality, or at least half of it. We'll come to it in a second. Either way, he says, in other words, whether this is about possibility or contingency, what is quite certain is that should you care to take the opposite route, what you find is able not to be able. Able not to be able. Able not to be able. I've never heard a better definition of mortality than able not to be able. But, let's just keep on with this. That is, it joins up with the unlikeliness, the obsolescence of what may occur, namely not the impossible to which one would return by looping the loop, whatever the fuck looping the loop means, but quite simply powerlessness. Whenever Lacan talks about powerlessness, deep sigh. I love when he talks about powerlessness. Here it is again. Note also that this is popping up in his other lecture series, his other Seminar 19 on the psychoanalyst knowledge. See our mini-series on this. We also made a fuss about powerlessness there as well. Here he is just kicking it out in the paragraph on the modalities. And I think this term powerlessness brings us pretty damn close to understanding what he's after when he talks about what does it mean to be able not to do something. Hold on. I'm just giving you the paragraph so you can have it all in front of you. This is just to indicate the second field of questions to be opened as a frontispiece. So here he is just throwing out at the start of Seminar 19 some of the shit he hopes to get into. Now at this point, we have only read through Chapter 4, and believe it or not, this is a lecture about Chapter 4. We haven't arrived there yet, but we'll get there. And he wants to say that I may come around this issue of powerlessness, about being able not to be able, about being able not to, and how that is distinct from the impossible. We haven't arrived at that yet, but I think we can begin speculating about where he might be headed in the coming pages. But page 13 is where all the modal stuff starts. I want you to have your eyes on this page as well, because it's incredibly useful for where we're headed next. Let's follow his lead. Let's just stick with this for a second. Page 13. Let's take it one step at a time, just like he does, from necessity to impossibility to something else. This something else that is a kind of powerlessness that Lacan suggests might be a figure of possibility or contingency. He doesn't, he's like, whether that's a legit question or whether he's just throwing that out there, he doesn't seem to know what to do with the ability not to do something yet. This powerlessness is where we're focused. Now, you heard me talk about the modalities in terms of their bearing on truth, specifically their ability to express certain truth values. Again, necessary truths, impossible truths, possible truths, contingent truths. Here, in this paragraph we just read, although Lacan doesn't say it explicitly, it's again the possible that catches our eye, but with quite a significant twist. At the start of Seminar 19, here on page 13, Lacan is thinking in terms of the possible, but along the lines of ability, capacity, power, capability, in short, of potentiality, and that is the fifth modality I want to introduce you to. Some might say that this is a subset of the possible, namely the potential. If the possible is about what might be, the potential is about what can be. But I think that the potential should be separate from the possible. Potentiality is not the same as something being possible. Now, this term, potentiality, it comes from the Aristotelian notion of dunamis. It's not about what might be, again, the possible, but instead it's about what can be, this dunamis that we find in Aristotle. And that makes a lot of sense when you recall that dunamis is also the etymological root of words in English like dynamic, but also even more clairvoyant here, dynamite. Let's not rush into this. Clear, coherent, and accessible. That's what we're up to here. Now you hear me talking fast, moving fast, trying to get after something. Let's just take a second. Start with what we know and see how close it can bring us to this new modality of the potential, of potentiality. Start with something more familiar. Let's start with necessity again. Indeed, that is the topic of Chapter 4, and this is a lecture on Chapter 4, believe it or not. If a certain behavior is necessary, we are not able not to engage in it. You see? And I know you see, because this is a very familiar Lacanian mode. Insistence, compulsion, the I couldn't help but that some Lacanians have talked about and made great use of. All of this shows the subject split between an unconscious impulse and an ego-embraced field of constraint. I couldn't help but. That suggests a certain type of necessity or compulsion. And this resistant part of self meeting up with an impulsive part of self, and the impulsive part of self willing out, to the extent that we could say, I couldn't help but engage in a certain behavior. It's a very familiar Lacanian mode. That's why I say, let's start with something more familiar, the necessary. I think this also explains Lacan's take on the impossible here. To be impossible is for something not to be able, Lacan tells us on page 13. But what interests him in all of this, I believe, is how this modality, the impossible, suggests another. Specifically, an ability not to do something, which we were just talking about. And even, as he puts it, an ability not to be able. And let me be clear, this is being toward death. I have an ability not to be able. That is my own most potentiality to die, at which point I am no longer able. Heidegger is all over this shit in the mid to late 1920s. This is, in many ways, the centerpiece of being in time, believe it or not. This being toward death is about our capacity not to be able. But we're not talking about that. If potentiality is about what can be done, Lacan is here angling towards its twin. They're not identical twins. They're not conjoined twins. But by God, if they aren't born at precisely the same time, and they live and die accordingly. Potentiality is about what can be done. But we're trying to ask the question of what does it mean to not be able? And beyond that, to be able not to do something. Remember, just read the page 13. This is how Lacan is starting to think his way through it. What he is arriving at, and again, his notion of powerlessness suggests this but doesn't quite put us on point, is the fact that every potential to do or be something always comes with a field of impotentiality. Not dunamis, but its counterpart, which Aristotle is very clear on, adynamia. For instance, you see these hands? I'm able to write with these hands. But in preserving this ability, here, by not writing and instead wiggling them on the screen, for those of you that are watching this lecture, I'm showing you that I also have the ability not to write. To have the ability to play the piano and to not be playing the piano is to also display the fact that you not only have the potential to play, but also the impotential to play. It's a weird way of thinking, but it's from Aristotle forward. I think Lacan is all over this. He just isn't saying as much quite yet. When I don't write, I show you that I also have the ability not to write. That's the important part here. Once I start writing, my potential to write and my impotential to write, they both disappear. They disappear straight into actuality. That's another modality here, by the way. The actual is a modality. The contingent impinges on the actual, right? Because if something is contingent, it is, but it didn't have to be. It does exist in the field of actuality, if you will. When I start writing, when I actually put pen to paper, I am no longer imbued with a capacity to write, technically speaking, because my capacity to write has been actualized, realized. But right now, because I'm not writing, no pen in hand, I possess both faculties, the ability to write, potentiality, and the ability not to write, impotentiality. And again, I think this is what Lacan is up to when he cues up powerlessness on page 13. And also in his parallel lectures on the psychoanalyst knowledge occurring across town, which we discussed in our last little mini-series. In my potential to write, if you want to think kind of weird about this, I am powerful. Power, potent, capable, ability. We're talking about the same thing here. When I say powerful, I don't just mean like strong or something because I can write. I have the capacity to write, and therefore I am strong. Although, think about this. 1,000 years ago, having the capacity to write was indeed one of the markers of strength and power in an otherwise juridical system. But here, now, when I say powerful, I want you to think a little figuratively about this. I am full of the capacity to write. I have the power to write. In my potential to write, I am powerful. But in my potential not to actualize this power, in other words, to not put pen to paper, and thereby to remain also in a field of impotentiality, I am also simultaneously not just powerful, but powerless. In the modality of potentiality, this fifth mode that we're talking about, I am able not to actualize certain capacities. And once you wrap your head around that, we can take it to the next level, which is to figure out what type of strength is indeed characteristic of this powerlessness. I'm not reading the New Testament here. This ain't Paul of Tarsus that I'm trying to bring to your attention here. This is not the power of the powerless, but it is related. It is related for reasons that I think are going to become clear, especially as we start pivoting around to feminine enjoyment again. Now, at this point, we're at a juncture. We could zoom out with what little we now know about impotentiality and talk about the truth of psychoanalysis, which is always a certain impotentiality, the name for which cannot be said enough. Castration. I'm going to leave that one to you. For us, right now, what I'd like to do, leaving aside the truth of psychoanalysis, which is the truth of castration, which is a kind of impotentiality, and what that means, I feel like we've discussed that enough. Maybe. But for now, I want to just stick with this modality of the potential, with an eye towards its implications for feminine enjoyment, and especially insofar as to be able is also to be able not to. If you have the ability to pick your nose, you also have the ability not to do it. Now, as soon as you start digging in your nose, both have passed into the field of actuality and are gone. You've now actualized that possibility. So you can pick your power, whether it's writing on paper or picking your nose. The logic is the same. When you can do something but do not engage in it, you exist in a field of potentiality and impotentiality at the same time. And that is what is at stake, fundamentally, when it comes to feminine jouissance, as we're about to see. Why? Why am I doing all this? Is it just about understanding feminine jouissance? Maybe. Let's see what we can make of it. It all points, in my view, to the truth of Lacan's first formula of feminine jouissance in particular. Women have the ability to engage in phallic enjoyment, but they also have the ability not to engage in phallic enjoyment. You see? And with this ability not to engage in phallic jouissance, this impotentiality comes an even more radical capacity, I believe. Namely, the capacity to engage in other non-phallic, extra-phallic forms of enjoyment. And by extra, I don't mean like, I almost said super phallic, but that doesn't quite get us there either. I'm trying to suggest something beyond phallic enjoyment, a beyond that is conditioned by the very contingent truth, which is that the women we meet show up as castrated. Whether any given woman is 1% or 99% castrated when she shows up, she always preserves her potential to enjoy in excess of the phallic function. That's what I mean by extra phallic. Beyond its castrative logic, and yet without necessarily subverting it either. That's the thing. Feminine enjoyment, when it pivots away from castrative logics, does not in so doing cancel out those logics. You see, that's just it. For men, it's really an either or. Either you're castrated or you don't exist. Sorry, fellas. For men, the phallic function is the end all and the be all. But that shit ain't true when it comes to women. Women's logic is not that of an either or, but a both and. You can be castrated and exist elsewhere. You can be determined by the phallic function and also be able to enjoy in other ways. In other words, for women, the phallic function is not all that enjoyment amounts to. But I insert that pause so you can hear also what Lacan is doing with the not all. Women's relation to castration is a not all relation because castration doesn't fully encompass the realms of enjoyment available to feminized subjects. For men, it's the end all and the be all. If you ain't castrated, you don't exist. If you aren't determined by the phallic function, you can't enjoy. For women, though, the phallic function is only one piece of the puzzle known as enjoyment. Their relation to the phallic function is not all that their enjoyment amounts to. In other words, there is nothing necessary about feminine enjoyment because it's not wholly determined by any one function, phallic or otherwise. Notice how I'm operationalizing one of our terms here. There's nothing necessary about feminine enjoyment because it's not wholly determined by any one function, whether it's phallic or otherwise. Now, the opposite is true with men, right? With masculine enjoyment, as we have seen, it is wholly determined by the phallic function and thus bound to modal logics of necessity. Feminine enjoyment is unbound enjoyment. Listen, I keep going on like this, but time is short. I'm still sick. So let's be as pointed as we can be, even at the risk of dropping the ball, fucking the whole thing up. Fill in your metaphor here. A couple of basic statements. Masculine enjoyment is decided enjoyment. It can only ever be phallic enjoyment. Enjoyment at the level of castration. Enjoyment at the level of a split subject who can't admit that part of self as they nevertheless go out in pursuit of other people's parts in hopes of filling a hole that they won't admit that they have to begin with. We don't need to rehearse all that. I think you got it. Feminine enjoyment, though, is different. If masculine enjoyment is decided, feminine enjoyment is undecidable. It's a great term that a lot of post-structuralist thinkers made great use of, maybe for the past 20 or 30 years. The undecidable is such a great term to have in the mix here. Masculine enjoyment is wholly decided. Feminine enjoyment is fundamentally undecidable. It remains ever open to modes of enjoyment that are phallic, but also modes of enjoyment that are not phallic and which are not limited to the field of castration. And you just never know. That's what I mean. It's undecidable. You don't know whether the next feminized subject you meet is going to show up with the castrative logic on display or in some other way. Now, if you're a wholly masculinized subject and you follow Lacan's thought, you probably won't even be able to recognize her. You probably wouldn't even see her in the realm of enjoyment. But for now, the key word here is undecidable. Conceptually, clinically, feminine enjoyment remains undecidable. It cannot be pinned down. And whenever it shows up in one way or another, that showing up is always contingent because in the very next moment, it could be otherwise. Which is precisely, I think, why it's so important to further specify the modality of feminine enjoyment, outlined in Lacan's famous formula, not all women are determined by the phallic function. I really want to specify this one. Possibility is just not quite enough. So I'm not just saying that Lacan's turn to the not impossible, this preliminary turn in Seminar 19 doesn't seem to suit his formula. But I'm saying that even if we correct for that and rename that the possible, even possibility fails to capture this undecidable aspect, fundamentally undecidable aspect of feminine enjoyment. The possible doesn't even bring us there. We are not just talking about possibility. Feminine engagements in phallic enjoyment and beyond are not simply possible. I'm not saying that they're impossible. I'm saying that the modality of the possible fails to account for the ways that women enjoy and the undecidable status of those ways. And don't forget, modality, modus, the mode is the way. Let me try and be precise again. Time is too short to move in any other direction. The modal logic I would like to offer in place of the possible is the potential. And the reason why I want to add the potential to our conversation, because it brings us precisely to the truth of feminine enjoyment, which is not just the potential, but its twin, impotentiality. And don't forget how we understand their relation, between potentiality and impotentiality, at least right now. From Aristotle to the work of Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben. He's really good. He's got a book called Potentiality. I think it's a collection. It's a terrific volume. Check it out. From Aristotle to Agamben, there's a long tradition of people thinking through the ability to do something and its relation to the ability not to do the very same thing. And here's how it shakes down. I think Agamben's got a really great bead on this if you want a more further, deeper account of this. Every potential to be or do something, writing, picking your nose, whatever, is always also a potential not to be or do this thing. If this weren't the case, just imagine the opposite. If this weren't the case, if every potentiality were not always also an impotentiality, what would that mean? It would mean that potentiality would always already have passed into actuality and thus be indistinguishable from it. Think about this. Now, this may sound like some idle philosophical shit, especially when your dear old sick instructor says, think about this. Think about this, man. Think about this, whoa, man. This may sound like some idle shit. Tell me it is not, and so I shall. At stake here, and on this point, I think Agamben, again, is precisely right. What we have here, when we link potentiality and impotentiality together in the only way that they can exist, which is to say linked and ever resistant to actuality, what we have here is what Agamben calls an abyss of potentiality. An abyss of potentiality whose effect on feminine subjects, I would add, is profoundly liberating. This is what's at stake here. It ain't got shit to do with philosophy. It's about freedom. What do I mean? What does it mean to be free? Oh shit, I just lapsed into another philosophical question. What is freedom? Nah, man, just think through it modally. To be free, according to Agamben, also thinking modally, is to be capable of one's own impotentiality. That's what he says. It's almost a direct quote from him. To be free is to be capable of one's own impotentiality. So you know Bartleby, that scrivener of lore on t-shirts galore. He would prefer not to. Don't get me wrong, I would prefer not to is good and all, but only up to a point. To be a woman is also to be empowered to say, I don't fucking have to. Bartleby would prefer not to. Feminine enjoyment allows those subject to it to also say, I don't have to. And when I say I don't have to, what I mean is I don't have to engage in phallic enjoyment the way men do. This is precisely what it means to be powerful, I would submit, at the risk of adding one more platitude atop one more platitude. I'm not talking here about juridical power, the type of power that used to come from the barrel of a gun, where power meant being able to make people do shit. That used to be power. You were powerful if you could make people do shit. That is not the type of power we're talking about here. And here I'm lapsing out of Agamben's thought and into that of Michel Foucault. For those of you that read beyond Lacan and into these other traditions, I always like to bring up these folks where they're relevant. Lacan's not the only wizard moving around the French intellectual scene at this time. Another is Michel Foucault. And he comes up with the idea of power at an administrative level, not a juridical level, not from the barrel of a gun, but at a bureaucratic, governmental level, if you will. Governmental power has to do with the ability to control someone's field of possible conduct. You control what someone can do. But there's more to it than that. At the level of impotentiality, we now get at the truth of what it means to be powerful today in the administrative order of late modernity. Freedom like power today, means not having to act. That's what it means to be powerful. Being rich, for instance, means you can wake up in the morning, not do shit, and at the end of the day still be rich. You can decide not to do anything. Fuck what you prefer, whether you prefer not to. You can just straight up not do anything. And at the end of the day, guess what? You're still rich. So also with power. Power means not having to act. Do you see where I'm going with this? Men have no choice. Not so with women. And that's what all this amounts to. The secret of freedom is also the secret of feminine enjoyment. It does not consist in the achievement of mastery over objective being, sorry boys, but instead in our ability to live, love, and enjoy, I'd say, in relation to our own privation, our own incapacity, our own impotentiality. And here I don't just want you to think castration, I want you to think non-being. Isn't this precisely what Lacanian psychoanalysis is about? Its ontology, if we could say that, is no such thing. The ontology of Lacanian theory and technique, as I've been saying since our series on Seminar 10, as Lacan very clearly states in Seminar 11. The ontology of Lacanian theory and technique is in fact a meontology, from the Greek meon meaning non-being. Look at all the Greek you're learning. Dunamis, eidaimia, and now you've got meon once more in your focal point. Non-being, not ontology, meontology, that is the centerpiece of Lacanian psychoanalysis. And so also with the Lacanian theory of freedom. It is freedom in non-being. This should be among our mottos. The motto of Lacanian theory and technique should be freedom in non-being. So think about it. Lacan is famous for all the shit he got to say about lack. But lack has never been the final word in his thought. Lack matters because at root it is about non-being. And the drive always outstrips desire for the very same reason. To live out one's drive is to learn to live with, and even joyously so, with one's non-being, you heard me say in our series on the drive, and after that as well. With all the lacks that we are, not just the ones that we have. Lacan's fundamental insight into lack is not just that it's something you have, but that it's something that each of us fundamentally is. And there is power in that non-being. There is power in that ontological lack that truly, in fact, is more of a meontological whole. So much the worse for men. If women are essentially free because they're only ever accidentally castrated, men are essentially unfree because their castration is anything but accidental. The truth of man's castration, as we have seen, is necessary. And there is no power to be had in this kind of powerlessness, which may explain much of what occurs in the misogynist West. Don't get me started on the misogynist East either. Maybe it's because men are wholly unfree, because they have no capacity and thus no incapacity either. And that women are just the opposite. Maybe this is why men seem so damn determined to regulate, legislate, and control women's bodies. Now, this is not where Lacan is headed in the opening chapters of Seminar 19, or at least it's not what he comes out and says. But I believe all of this is implicit in his thought. At this point, dialing it back just a smidge, all Lacan wants to do is iron out these different modal logics. And I think that in chapter 4, the modal logic that he wants to return to is the one that he feels most comfortable with, and that is necessity. And maybe he's thinking this is the one that his audience is most comfortable with. But necessity is the centerpiece of chapter 4, you heard me say. And that's exactly where he turns. The necessity endemic to the masculine structure. So you heard me say that feminine enjoyment should have the modal logic of potentiality, which always brings with it a logic of impotentiality. Women's relation to castration is just that. They can engage in the phallic function. They can participate in male castrative logics. But they don't have to. They can choose not to actualize that capacity. Men have no choice. To be a masculinized subject in Lacan's formulations here is to have no choice. You have no choice but to participate in the phallic function. No castration, no enjoyment. For women, no castration, no problem. There are other ways to enjoy. Castration for women is a choice, you might say. For men, it is not. I think in chapter 4, Lacan wants to put everybody back into the comfort zone of necessity as it relates to the masculine structure. And what he wants to do is he wants to focus, I believe, on the presuppositional logic, read retroactivity, of every necessary discourse. And remember, that's what he's talking about here. Necessity is always a discursive operation. It's an effect of speaking being. Remember how he puts this. Remember, when you look up logics of necessity, why it always comes down to, I hate to say it, it's another one of these philosophical terms that just, come on, it comes down to syllogisms. I made a rule to myself a long time ago that in any given lecture I was only ever going to use the word, can we just call it the S word? No, too many S's in Lacan's thought. Syllogism, I was only going to use it once in any given lecture. Couldn't use it twice. Just such a fucking ridiculous word. But anyway, that's what it is. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, necessarily, the conclusion that is unavoidably true as a result, that is necessarily true, that can't possibly be false, is that Socrates is going to die. That's a syllogism. It is also a discursive construct. It's at the level of discourse that necessity comes into focus. And that is also what Lacan has in mind here. Let's take a crack at this. And by this, I mean chapter 4. Chapter 4 of Seminar 19 is fairly straightforward. There's one theoretical move and 4 or 5 illustrations. And all of these, theory and example alike, are things you already know, backwards and forwards, especially if you've tuned into our previous series, and all with bearing, I would add, on the logical necessity of the masculine subject, castrated sons and mythical fathers alike. So let's start then with the theoretical move here. 1. When Lacan says necessity, he means logical necessity. And by this, again, he means discursive necessity. And don't forget how we arrive at this. In Aristotle's Greek, it's another Greek word, logos means discourse. The idea that you could have like a logical discourse is kind of redundant, you've heard me say, and this is the reason why. Lacan in chapter 4 really sharpens this up. A logical necessity is always a discursive necessity. Great passage for us to consider here is on page 38. Toward the bottom. Reflect on this. Logical necessity, there can be no other, is the upshot of this production. Necessity only begins with the speaking being. And by like token, everything that might appear to have been produced by it is invariably the doing of a discourse. If this really is what is at issue in tragedy, it's precisely insofar as tragedy is made concrete as the upshot of a necessity that is logical. This is obvious, for here it's a matter only of speaking beings. This is what he's up to. Every necessity is a logical necessity, is a discursive necessity, is a necessity driven and determined, and a matter only for speaking beings. Now, that this logical necessity, qua discursive necessity, is closely tied to masculine sexuation, I think this is readily apparent in a passage we highlighted last time. It's from page 35. And it's worth reading again because it shows that Lacan is already queuing this up in the previous chapter, and then he just wants to make chapter 4 all about this structure. It's at the bottom of page 35. The passage, one we just read in our last couple of lectures, goes as follows. Doesn't this suggest to you, I'm sowing this seed so that it might resonate here next time, he says in chapter 3, next time here indicating chapter 4, that what is up here on the top left in this formula that says there exists one man for whom the phallic function is not operable, the at least one in question results from a necessity. And it's in this precise respect that it's a matter of discourse. There is only any necessity qua spoken. And this necessity is what makes the existence of man possible as a sexual value. Contrary to what Aristotle put forward. Sorry, Aristotle. The possible is the opposite of the necessary. The mainspring of the possible lies in this backwards capital EX being opposed to the upside down capital AX. The part I want you to notice here is that even in chapter 3, he's queuing up this element of necessity that is wholly discursive. Necessity qua spoken. And this becomes the centerpiece, or at least the starting point into the centerpiece of chapter 4. Make no mistake, chapter 4 is a chapter about the logical structure of masculine enjoyment, and with it, the sexual value of man, just as Lacan promised on that page we just read. Second big point, theoretically speaking here. Logical necessity is not just discursive necessity. It's also, more precisely, as you heard me say, retroactive necessity. Why? Because in order for a necessity to hold, something must be presupposed, according to Lacan, and he's precisely right. A something which, relative to this necessity, is technically speaking nothing. Nothing here, though, does not equal nothingness. Lacan is also explicit about this in chapter 4. We don't need to rehearse the passage. You can read it. The word Lacan uses, though, to capture this nothing that is not the same as nothingness that is presupposed, and so on, by any necessary discourse. The word he uses for this is inexistence. Inexistence. Inexistent, inexistence. That's the word he wants to use, or at least that's the word that comes through in the English translation that we're considering in this series. Here's the main claim. If you've got ears to hear, here it is. Logical necessities presuppose in a retroactive fashion the inexistence of their own conditions of possibility. Now, I don't usually like to say shit like that, but there it is. If you just want the truth of what's happening in chapter 4, here it is. Logical necessities, masculine or otherwise, presuppose in a retroactive fashion the inexistence of their own conditions of possibility. Now, can we earn that motto? Can we earn that statement? I think so. In fact, in many ways, I think we already have. What this means is that logical necessities are structured exactly like language, namely in terms of repetition of the Lacanian sort. Recall what you already know about repetition. All repetitions for Lacan are retroactive. You've heard me say in our previous series. It's still with him here in Seminar 19. Why are they retroactive? Because they not only index earlier entities or events, but also redesignate these entities or events as origins, specifically lost origins, at least lost as figured from the present looking back. These entities or events of the past can become what's repeated only in a subsequent act of repetition. So for example, tuning in to lectures on Lacan, it was not a repeated event for you when you first discovered this series, but only after your return at a later date for another lecture, another series, whatever. And here's the key point. Relative to these subsequent moments, additional lectures, additional series, new episodes in the podcast, whatever, the first moment, your first encounter with our work, technically speaking, is no longer. You may recall that moment, vividly perhaps even. Here, I am the one engaged in fantasy. But it's gone. The moment is gone no matter how well you recall it, this original first moment, etc. It's in the past. It's no longer present, except in hindsight, retrospectively. And even if you don't remember your first foray into lectures on Lacan, here returning to reality, the logic still holds. Unless this lecture is your first, there's been at least one before it, and probably many more. Back to fantasy. All of which, as lived experiences, are no longer. I mean, unless this is indeed your first time tuning into lectures on Lacan, we can presuppose these earlier moments. And not just can presuppose, we must presuppose them. If this is not your first foray into this lecture series, we must presuppose an origin. At stake here, and I believe this is the central stake in Chapter 4, is a supposition of inexistence. And Lacan here, note the emphasis. The emphasis here is not on inexistence. He don't give a fuck about inexistence. What he cares about is the suppositional logic in which inexistence finds expression. His emphasis in Chapter 4 is on the supposition in supposition of inexistence. That's crucial, absolutely crucial, and totally in line with what we've been up to the past couple series. It's in the here and now of a logical necessity that we presuppose a then and there, which no longer exists. In other words, which inexists. That's what's up. It's in the here and now of a logical necessity that the presupposition finds expression. The presupposition of a then and there that is no longer, and it's a presupposition as a result of inexistence. The then and there, let me try and be clear, only exists as a statement of inexistence pronounced in the present. God, it's tough to talk about this shit sometimes, you know? And I can't imagine, tough to talk about. It's tough to hear some of this shit. I can't even imagine this. The then and there exists as a statement of inexistence pronounced in the present? The fuck, McCormick? Yeah, but slow down. You know all this. Be patient. This thought has washed over you so many times already. Unless, of course, this is your first foray into lectures on Lacan. This line of thought is everywhere in Lacan's work, and it's been everywhere in our commentaries on his work. Check it out. Sexual jouissance only exists as its prohibition in the field of surplus enjoyment. Now, do you see where we're headed? The real only exists as a statement of impossibility in the symbolic. Now, do you see where we're headed? The part of truth that cannot be said only exists in pronouncements of the part of truth that can be said, and which always, don't forget, say the exact same thing. There's more to this than can be said. Now do you see where we're headed? The unconscious only exists as the inexistent, retroactive cause of symptomatic expressions that can hardly be denied, even if that's all we do when the symptom finds us. Lacan, not coincidentally, has all of these examples in mind in Chapter 4. Check it out. The unconscious and the symptom, you say? Page 39. And he gives you the example of how this shit works. And remember what's at stake here. We're looking at the way that logical, discursive necessities, constructs in the field of speaking being, presuppose the inexistence of the very conditions of possibility that allow for them. That's what we're trying to chop up here. On page 39, Lacan says, if you understand how the unconscious works relative to symptoms, you can see how this works. Here it is. From one instant to the next, inasmuch as the unconscious exists, you are carrying out the demonstration by which inexistence is grounded as what is preliminary to what is necessary. This is the inexistence of what lies behind the principle of the symptom. It has been so ever since the term assumed its value in emerging with Marx. It is the very consistence of the said symptom. What lies behind the principle of the symptom is the inexistence of the truth that it presupposes, even though it marks out its place. The unconscious is the presuppositional truth whose inexistence is necessitated by symptomatic expressions. Symptoms presuppose lost commands from the unconscious. It's at the level of the symptom, by way of the symptom, in the modal logic, in the mode of the symptom, that we start understanding something about the unconscious. Don't forget, knowledge of the truth of the unconscious that is the cause of the analyst's agency in the discourse of the analyst, that doesn't come from knowledge of the unconscious. It is earned through the analytic work of chopping up symptoms. It's at the level of the symptom that we gain insight into the unconscious, indirect insight. Because technically speaking, the unconscious does not exist. It inexists, if you will. Okay, let's take another one of these examples. Sexual jouissance. This one's been on our horizon for a while now, certainly since seminar 17, where sexual enjoyment exists in relation, in what I call reciprocally constitutive relation, to the repeated consumptions, acquisitions, and subsequent letdowns of surplus enjoyment. Lacan goes here next, from the bottom of page 39 to the top of page 40. In the second case, it is the inexistence of jouissance. And here what he means is sexual jouissance as forbidden jouissance. It is the inexistence of jouissance that the so-called automatism of repetition brings to the light of insistence, of the stamping at the door that is designated as the exit towards existence. Beyond the door, however, what lies in wait for you is not altogether what is called existence. It is rather jouissance, such as it is operative as the necessity of discourse. And you see, it operates only as inexistent. How does forbidden sexual jouissance operate? It operates in the field of surplus enjoyment as a presupposed inexistent. You know what Lacan even does? For those that aren't really steeped in all this Lacanian mumbo jumbo, as they say, he even cues up the basic social scientific notion of an adjacency pair. Not all of you are social scientists. I know you come from different traditions, but the adjacency pair is a really classic form or figure in conversation analytic scholarship. And a great example of this is the question and the answer. Questions come with answers. Questions beget answers. But Lacan is saying there's more to questions than the answers they beget. And in fact, there's more to their begetting of answers than just this causal logic. What Lacan wants to say is that to ask a question is not just to beget an answer. It's also more fundamentally to presuppose one. And you have to hear this, because it's exactly what he's saying marks the relationship between all men are castrated and the impossibility of one man who is not castrated. That impossibility exists as a stated, professed, adhered to fantasy, as a discourse within the field of masculine subjectivity. Men fantasize about this guy who doesn't exist, this real man, in their own jouissance. That's why Lacan also says that it is fundamentally a homosexual structure, the masculine structure, with an extra M in there to indicate that it is a man structure. It's a masculine structure that has a kind of gay undertone to it, because we're always dreaming about this real man, this uncut daddy who doesn't exist, who can't exist, but god damn, if we could just become him. You see, this is what Lacan has in mind here. The real father is an inexistent presupposed by the fact that there are men, all of whom are castrated. You start wrapping your heads around this and you can see how Lacan is operating. This is how he thinks about things. And do you know what this line of thought is? This kind of presuppositional, logical line of thought is? It's not just Aristotelian. It's not even Aristotelian. It belongs to the one who actually overcame Aristotle, who actually outdid the big A, Kant. And Lacan is no Kant, but he does think like a Kantian. The Kantian procedure known as critique, which is a line of inquiry that Immanuel Kant invented in the 1780s and arguably the decade prior. But it's in the 1780s and 90s that critique as a genre of discourse, as a mode of inquiry is developed. It is about questioning the presuppositions that allow for the existence of any given fact, figure, entity, or event. That's what critique is. Critical inquiry is about questioning the presuppositions that allow for any given discourse formation to hold. Now, that can be a necessary, logical discursive formation, as in the case of masculine enjoyment. Lacan is thinking like a Kantian here. So Aristotle is still top of mind for our guy. But let me tell you, he is also thinking presuppositionally. It's a good sign when you're checking out secondary scholarship on Lacan, and they want to put Lacan in the history of ideas into intellectual and cultural history, when they don't just link Lacan to Hegel, but also position him within the entire German idealist tradition, which begins with Kant. Lacan is more of a Kantian than he is a Hegelian, I would argue, and especially here in Chapter 4. Questions. They beget answers, but what Lacan wants to say is that they also presuppose answers. It's a really simple example, and it's one I want to call your attention to, so that in the midst of all this madness, because I'm asking you to think like Kantians as well, in addition to learning Lacan. In the midst of all this, here's something clear to have in mind. It's on page 39, middle of the page. What is necessity? This is the opening gambit in Chapter 4. Such that from the very fact of producing it, it can only, before being produced, be presupposed as inexistent, which means posed as such in discourse. And here it is. There is a response to this question, as there is to any question, due to the reason that it is posed, as is any question, only when one already has the response. It's not just that questions beget answers, questions also presuppose them. And now let me ask you this. What type of a question is able to presuppose an inexistent? Now we're back to thinking like Lacanians. You add up all these examples, and you start to see, I believe, what Lacan is up to with the key pronouncement of Chapter 4 of Seminar 19. It's on page 40. I asked, what is the necessity that is established on the basis of a supposition of inexistence? There it is. In this question, and he's still asking a question here, what counts is not that which is inexistent, but rather the supposition of inexistence, which is merely a consequence of producing necessity. What matters is not what is repeated, it's the act of repetition and its ability to index that earlier moment and mark it as an original. That's what matters. What is repeated? The original event, the earlier entity? Who fucking cares? What matters for Lacan is the way that a repetition in the here and now does this retroactive work of indexing and redesignating, reaching back into the past and transforming an earlier entity or event into an original event that is in a future moment to be repeated. If you've got ears to hear, that will have been repeated. Don't forget, Lacan's first foray into the modalities, you heard me say, is not through Kant, it's not through Aristotle, it is through Heidegger. And that future anterior tense of what will have been is crucial to Lacan's earlier thought. I don't know if he just broke his brain on that topic. I would love it if he got back into some more future anterior stuff here. I think it makes a lot of sense, especially when thinking around logics of potentiality. But I digress. This illness of mine, I digress. Here I am, trying to iron out the details of necessity and inexistence presupposed, necessarily castrated men and the inexistence of a supposed uncut daddy, and there I go, lapsing back into feminine enjoyment. Ah, feminine enjoyment. Do you hear what I'm doing? I'm fucking with you, but you know where I'm at here? It sucks to be a man. To be masculinized in this Lacanian way, it utterly sucks. It's way better to be feminized, way better to exist in the field of feminine enjoyment. There are risks, there are pains, there are pleasures, and there is also suffering, constraint, misogyny, and abuse of every sort. Nevertheless, to be a man, you get the sense, for Lacan, masculine structures are fucking tragic, constrained, limited. They're awful. Is it any surprise that those who occupy them so often turn out to be awful too? Now, I don't mean all the time. I'm not even saying most of the time. But when you start stacking up masculine haters and feminine haters, I dare say you'll have more in one category than in the other. But I didn't come here to talk to you all about that. I came here with a theory and some examples, all pulled straight from Chapter 4. And that's exactly where we want to focus our attention here. The wager is that it's in the here and now of the symbolic, of surplus enjoyment, of the symptom, of the question, that we retroactively presuppose the inexistence of the real, sexual jouissance, the unconscious, and the answer. Lacan is determined to drive this point home. Next page, page 41. We get a great statement of this logical necessity that he's working with and the way it operates presuppositionally. Inexistence is only produced in the retroaction from which there first arises necessity, namely from a discourse in which it manifests itself prior to the logician reaching it himself as a second consequence, that is, at the same time as inexistence itself. Couple lines down. I repeat, demonstrating it this time at the same time as I state it. You see, so he's illustrating what it is he means to get at here by a theory of repetition that retroactively marks an earlier moment. How? By repeating himself. This necessity is repetition itself, in itself, by itself, for itself. That is to say, the very thing through which life demonstrates that it is merely a necessity of discourse. You know what's missing from this? It's the only thing that's missing at this point. You know what would make this just really great? You know what would make this like next level amazing and super duper fun? You know what's missing from chapter 4 that we need? We need a little more math. Where's the math in all this? Let's get some mathematics popping. Lacan, not coincidentally, this is how he starts to wind down chapter 4. He's like, you need one more illustration? Girl, let's talk about math. Okay. So let's add the mathematical part of this. It's not complicated, and again, it's an illustration you've already seen. You already know this shit. He's queuing it up, I think because he knows his audience also already knows this. What's missing from these examples, the examples we're just messing with, the symbolic relative to the real, surplus enjoyment relative to sexual jouissance, the unconscious, or the symptom relative to the unconscious, the question relative to the answer. We just go on listing examples, a really common line of thought for Lacan. I chuckle because we've been through this so many times, and he's queuing it up, I think, in a really clear fashion in chapter 4. It's useful, if only to see how he thinks repetition as always having a retro-efficacy. And what he's adding is that sometimes these conditions of possibility are inexistent. And if we think about lost moments, moments that are past that are no longer, inexistence is really a terrific way to describe them. They do not exist relative to the present, in which their pastness, their goneness, their no longertude is pronounced. He wants to add to this a mathematical twist, but like all things Lacanian when it comes to math, it's some pretty basic shit. Don't trip. And it's math that you've seen before. At the top of page 44, this is where he starts getting into it. I suppose we should just take a look at this. It is clear, nonetheless, that we cannot avoid taking into account what has been produced by a logical necessity, by confronting it with the integers, for the reason that this retroactive necessity implies the supposition of what inexists as such. Now, it is remarkable that it was in examining the integer, in having broached its logical generation, that Frege was led to found the number 1 upon the concept of inexistence. So he wants to trace this back to the logical mathematical thinking of Frege around the 1 as founded on a concept of inexistence. And it's a concept that you know at this point that we've been over numerous times. How do you represent the inexistence presupposed by the integer 1, to say nothing of any numerical sequence that follows? Well, with the number 0, of course. What does Lacan mean by 0 here in chapter 4 of Seminar 19? The same thing he claims that Frege does. 0, he says, is the concept of, and I quote, an emptiness under which no object falls. It is the concept, not of nothingness, because it's a concept, but of inexistence. It's on page 45, you can find the quote. If 0 is the concept of inexistence, the number 1, according to Lacan, is the signifier of inexistence. And it's with this 1, not the 0, it supposes, that we typically begin to count, repeating number after number in any given sequence, but always in a way that presupposes zero as a concept of inexistence. That's Lacan's point. Just as surplus enjoyment presupposes the inexistence of sexual jouissance in surplus enjoyment, so also does every sequence of numbers presuppose the existence of zero as a concept of inexistence. The figure of this logic is one that we have discussed before, notably in our series most recently on Seminar 18. It's this n plus 1 ... that Lacan cues up there. If n in n plus 1 ... equals 0, we can count to 6, but only by arriving always at 7 numbers. And Lacan does this as well in Chapter 4. And the count goes like this: 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In order to count to 6, you actually need 7 numbers. 7 of what? Lacan asks at the end of this chapter. 7 of this something that I have termed inexistent on account of it being the foundation of repetition, he answers. Which begs another question, a question whose answer you probably already sense, maybe even presuppose. As inexistent? I don't know. We'll see. Why is Lacan talking about all this here? And why is this chapter on masculine subjectivity and all of its necessary logical structure culminating in this n plus 1 ... For the same reason that he cues up this n plus 1 ... in Seminar 18. Because this is precisely the mathematical logic of masculine subjectivity relative to that damn father, the real father. The n in n plus 1, you've heard me say, is the presupposed inexistent 0 point of the mythical father, whose impossibly uncastrated enjoyment guarantees, indeed founds by way of exception, the necessarily castrated enjoyments of all men, one right after the other, exactly as they also hope to acquire women, I might add, one right after the other. But we're not reading Seminar 20. We're not there yet. And Lacan is not there yet, at least by our reckoning. We're in Chapter 4 of Seminar 19, and this is why he cues up the n plus 1. If all men, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all of them are gathered up in this sequence, this total set of all the integers, there's always this 0 that stands outside, a marker of inexistence presupposed by any given sequence of integers. The same is true of the mythical real father. It's the inexistent, impossible man that guarantees the total count of all men, whose unfreedom relative to the field of castration is exactly what we're focused on here. The magic word for this is necessity. Men have no choice. Like I said, so much the worse for them.